Hello, my name is Daniel Tang. I'm a property solicitor and a member of the Lease Advice Bureau. Today I'm going to be talking to you about how to extend your lease. Leasehold is one of the two most common forms of ownership in the UK, the other being freehold. I'll briefly talk about the difference between the two types. So freehold is an indefinite form of ownership, so most houses in the UK are held under a freehold title. It basically means that the person who owns the freehold gets to own that property forever. By contrast, leasehold is designed to be held for a particular period of time. A lease is granted usually for 99 or 125 years originally. It's the common form of ownership for flats. So in most cities where most forms of property ownership are flats, leasehold is the prevailing type of property ownership. So the lease length becomes quite an important issue for a lot of the people who are trying to sell their flats. Often that's the time where the lease length suddenly becomes an issue for people. So I'll be explaining why that is. So lease length is not just important for how long one wants to own or live in the property. It's actually quite important because it affects the marketability of a flat. In other words, how easy it is to sell that property. So most mortgage lenders will not finance the purchase of a leasehold property that has fewer than 75 years remaining. This is because they view the security of their investment as a risk factor if the lease is below that length. So this is why if someone's trying to sell a property that has fewer than 75 years, they're restricting their potential market to cash buyers only, and this drives the price down. So it is the case in my experience that quite a lot of leaseholders only become aware of the short lease issue when it comes time for them to sell, and an estate agent tells them that actually it's going to be difficult for them to do so unless they extend their lease. So in my business, I quite often see potential clients coming to me at this stage when they want to sell the property, and unfortunately they can't do so without first trying to extend. So this doesn't just become an issue around the 75-year mark. Actually, a lease that falls below 100 years is already raises some eyebrows when it comes to lease length. And this has a lot to do with how the purchase price for lease extensions is calculated and formulated. So how does one go about extending their lease? Well, there are effectively two ways that people can extend their lease. The first way is known by three different names, really, just to make things a bit complicated. Either the informal way, or it's sometimes known as the voluntary way, or also the non-statutory way. These are three terms that just mean the same thing. It's just the way that it's possible for the leaseholder and their landlord, usually the freeholder, to just simply strike a deal between themselves as to the terms for the lease extension. By terms of a lease extension, what I mean is the purchase price for the lease extension, how long the extension will be. So potentially a landlord can grant a 50-year extension or 100 years. The sky's the limit, really, when it comes to this kind of agreement. And also what the new ground rent is going to be, which is an interesting topic because that position has changed as of 2022 because it's no longer possible to increase rent in leases. But those three elements are up for negotiation between the leaseholder and freeholder, when it comes to extending the lease. So this method, the informal method of extending the lease, has been a possibility between landlords and tenants from the advent of leases. It's the, I suppose, traditional way of negotiating. And it's still a potential way to extend the lease. I would say from experience, roughly about half the extensions are done in this kind of way. There are pros and cons between this approach and what I'll go into when I talk about the formal statutory approach, but it does have some advantages. For one, it is quite quick, and it allows for degrees of flexibility as well. I'll be going further into the pros and cons between these two different approaches in due course, but for now that's the informal method in a nutshell. So by contrast, there is the formal or statutory method of extending the lease. So this has been available since 1993, when legislation came out to give leaseholders the right to claim a lease extension. So before that, it wasn't possible for leaseholders to simply claim a lease extension for flats, although I should mention that it's been possible for leaseholders of houses to be able to claim extensions for houses since 1967, when the Leasehold Reform Act came out for houses. But for flats, the right has only been available since 1993, and that legislation sets out what the leaseholder is entitled to, and the method of calculation for how much the leaseholder has to pay the landlord in exchange for the lease. So what are the statutory terms that you're entitled to receive? So for a statutory extension, you're granted 90, that's 90 years being added on to whatever you have remaining. The ground rent becomes a peppercorn, which basically means nil, so the ground rent gets taken out. And the lease terms are effectively going to remain the same as what they were before, so there shouldn't be any alteration in your rights and responsibilities under the lease when you extend the lease. So that's what you're entitled to, and legislation sets out a method of calculation for how much you're supposed to pay for the lease extension. Now this is the important part, I would say, because this is where the law could potentially be changing in the near future with the abolition of marriage value. So I'll go into some detail in explaining what all that means. So, how is lease extension price calculated? There are three main factors in calculating a lease extension price. There is the value of the flat, so that's looking at the long lease value. So you have to imagine that the lease that you're trying to extend is actually a long lease already, and then coming to an estimate for how much that would sell on the open market. So that's what we call the value. The second factor is the ground rent. So how much per year the lease states is payable to the landlord in ground rent. So that becomes a factor in the calculation. And thirdly, and most importantly, is how short the lease currently is. So this part, the third part, is the most influential factor in the calculation. The idea being that the shorter a lease gets, the closer it is to when the freeholder is supposed to reclaim that property. So the idea being that if the lease falls to zero, that the freeholder should be able to receive his property back. And if you imagine that if the lease was approaching the 0 point and someone was trying to purchase the lease extension, the price for that lease extension would roughly be the same price as purchasing the flat outright. So that gives you an idea about how this equation works. Effectively, it's an exponential growth rate for the premium price depending on how short the lease gets. Marriage value is, aside from the standard reversionary depreciation that takes place the shorter a lease gets, marriage value is something that compounds that calculation, effectively meaning that it's dialed up to 11, as it were. And this affects leases that are shorter than 80 years remaining. So marriage value only affects leases that have below 80 years currently unexpired. So when we talk about this new reform that's coming into place next year, where the law is abolishing marriage value, it is really only affecting those particular flats that have fewer than 80 years. Those that have more than 80 years need not be too concerned with that change. And therefore, those that are potentially waiting to make a saving, potentially there's not going to be too much of a saving if your lease is already above 80 years. So that's the kind of method of calculation in a nutshell. You can use these online calculators to give you a rough idea of how much that premium is likely to cost. But in all cases, we would recommend using a surveyor that specializes in lease extensions. We have them at Lease Advice Bureau, so do get in touch if you do want to speak to a lease extension surveyor. So let me talk a little bit about the process that's involved with extending your lease. So the legislation sets out this process whereby you get your own valuation done by your surveyor. So in all cases, you need your own lease extension surveyor. And the law expects you to serve a claim notice on your landlord, expressing an offer figure within that notice. So the method of calculation that I mentioned earlier has to be accounted for in this offer, which means you can't simply just offer £50 in a notice and send that to the landlord hoping he'll accept it. The notice is only valid providing you make your offer in good faith. So there's lots of case law which covers the validity of these kinds of notices, and in order for it to be valid, it does have to be a realistic offer made. So you would need a lease extension surveyor to formulate that price. It's for your solicitor to then prepare that notice and serve it upon your landlord, serving meaning giving it to your landlord, which is actually quite a more complicated point than one would think. There are lots of cases where landlords have denied service because they haven't been sent to the correct destination, and some landlords will try to escape the requirements under the legislation on those grounds. So it is important that your solicitor be given an opportunity to investigate the various addresses that the landlord may have in order to serve this notice. So once that notice is served, it creates what's called a binding statutory contract with him, meaning that he can't refuse to comply with its terms. The landlord has effectively 2 months of which to respond to this notice and serve what's called a counter notice. So a counter notice is like a counter offer. It's designed to reserve the landlord's highest negotiation point. So the landlord will counter offer a price which is usually quite a bit higher than the leaseholder's opening offer. Before serving that counter notice, the landlord is entitled to inspect the leaseholder's property, to ask for a 10% deposit of the offered amount the leaseholder has made, and the landlord is entitled to receive the title copies to verify that the leaseholder does indeed qualify under the legislation. So the leaseholder has to have owned the property for at least 2 years to qualify for a lease extension. Now, this is something that is looking to be changed in the upcoming leasehold reforms, the abolition of this 2-year requirement. But at present, that 2-year requirement is still in place. Leaseholders need to have owned the property 2 years in order to be able to qualify for this kind of what we call a statutory lease extension. So once the council notice is received, and I should say that if the landlord does not serve a council notice within the 2-month period that he's been afforded to do so, then he loses the right to negotiate the price and simply has to accept the leaseholder's price within the leaseholder's claim notice. So it is very important for landlords to indeed serve a counter notice before that deadline expires. After that point, it then enters into what we call the negotiation period. So the negotiation period usually takes place between the leaseholder's surveyor and the landlord's surveyor. Now, in most cases, the surveyors reach terms as to what the final price should be. But in the rare case that no agreement can be reached, the legislation provides the leaseholder with the opportunity to apply to the first-tier tribunal, which is basically the property court, for the tribunal to decide what the price, otherwise known as the premium, should be. Once the terms are agreed, and what's called the terms of acquisition are agreed, and I should mention that there's a 6-month period for that to occur before one would need to apply to the tribunal, because failing to either agree or apply to the tribunal within that 6-month period results in what is called a deemed withdrawal. So that the legislation basically puts the pressure on the leaseholder to ensure that there is movement on the agreement, or to ask the tribunal to assist, because if the leaseholder fails to do so, then their claim is effectively cancelled. But in the vast majority of cases, the landlord and tenant do reach terms of the lease extension, and then it's simply a matter of dealing with the legal paperwork, the conveyancing, as it were, for the lease extension, the agreement of the new lease terms, and for this to be completed and registered at the land registry. So in most cases, this happens relatively smoothly, and that's why the statutory procedure is viewed as the most assured way of extending your lease. But one of the most frequent questions I'm asked is, which one of these two options should I choose? The informal way or the statutory way? And unfortunately, there isn't an easy answer to that one. It really depends on the circumstances, what's currently on offer by your landlord. Because in the informal method, effectively, the landlord can give you what's called a take it or leave it offer. He can provide you with, what he often does is he will ask you to pay for his surveyor to formulate an offer for you, and providing that's acceptable to you, then the matter can simply be dealt with by the solicitor. But it is a take it or leave it position, so whether the leaseholder wants to verify whether the offer is a good one by approaching their own surveyor is definitely a matter for that leaseholder, and something we would recommend in all instances to ensure that you get a good deal. But that is an option. So as I mentioned earlier, the informal method is quicker because it doesn't need to follow through those statutory procedures that I've mentioned earlier, such as the 2-month waiting time for a counter notice, the 6-month negotiation period. So all of those time periods are irrelevant in an informal method. So potentially you're saving a lot of potential time by making an informal deal like this. Of course, the flip side is that that informal extension is not regulated, which basically means if the landlord decides that he wants to amend your lease to insert some onerous clauses which maybe benefit him but don't really benefit you, the leaseholder, very much, then that's going to be difficult to argue against without the whole deal coming to a close. So those are effectively the pros and cons with each approach. A lot of clients who want to sell immediately are a bit stuck because they've only just realized that their lease is short and now they're under pressure to quickly make an agreement. So that's one of the catches that we often see ourselves in, and something we would obviously try to avoid or recommend that clients pay a bit more attention to their lease earlier to avoid those kinds of situations. So that's lease extensions in a nutshell. If you have any questions, please do leave comments below. If there's any other types of videos or topics wish us to cover, then please do leave a comment below. And if you like this video, click like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.